food chains, food webs, and the energy pyramid. The food chain has four basic parts: the sun, producers, consumers, and decomposers. The sun is what supplies the energy for all life on Earth. It provides solar energy. The solar energy then goes into the producers. They're called producers because they produce glucose. They make energy. They make chemical energy. So basically, the producers take the solar energy from the sun and convert it to glucose, a sugar that all the other organisms can live. The next, the consumers. Consumers are the organisms that have to eat. So they could eat the producers or they could eat other consumers, but they get their energy by eating. And the last category is decomposers. Decomposers would basically break down the organism after they die and return the nutrients back to the soil. So in the picture here, we have the grass. Those are the producers. The grass got their energy from the sun. So the grass took the solar energy and converted it to glucose. And then we have the consumers. We have the rabbit and the fox. The rabbit got his energy by eating, or you could say by consuming the grass. And the fox got his energy by consuming the rabbit. And when that fox dies, the decomposers, which is mostly bacteria, will break the fox down and return his nutrients back to the ground. As we said earlier in the last slide, the sun is the ultimate source of energy in the entire world. Without the solar energy, the producers would not have the ability to make glucose, to make sugar for the rest of us. Producers are called producers because they produce glucose. They make energy. Plants make their own food through the process of photosynthesis. In Latin, photo means light, synthesis means to make, and in Latin we read backwards to forward. So photosynthesis literally means to make from light. And what they're making is sugar. They're making glucose. It says here that you contain the most energy. That's why veggies are so good for you to eat, because producers are the closest in the food chain to the sun. Every time something gets eaten, only 10% of the energy goes to the next trophic level. So the closer you can get to the plants, the more energy you will have. It's called the 10% law. Consumers are ones who consume, or you could say the ones who eat. These are organisms that get their food and energy by eating other organisms. Another name for consumers is heterotroph. We humans are in the animal kingdom, and we, of course, we have to consume, we have to eat. There are different types of consumers. The first one we're going to talk about is primary consumers. Primary means first, consumer means to eat. So these are the organisms that eat first. If you're eating first, you must be eating a plant because that's the closest to the sun you can get as far as eating is concerned. So you are also called an herbivore. An herbivore is an organism that only eats producers. Next in line is called the secondary consumers, and they're called that because they eat second. You could say they consume second. And if you're consuming second, that means you must be eating the primary consumers. This is when we introduce the word carnivore. A carnivore is an organism that only eats meat. In this case, they're eating the primary consumers. Next, we have tertiary consumers. Tertiary consumers are the ones who eat the secondary consumers, or you could say they're the ones who eat third. And they are also carnivores because the secondary consumer itself is an animal. We have two other categories. The first one is scavenger. Scavenger are organisms that feed off dead things. As you can see in the picture here, the zebra is being eaten by the scavengers. Lastly, we have parasites. Parasites are organisms that live in or on another organism. So if you think of a tick would live on you. You can think of a tapeworm living inside of you, but these are called parasites. So they get their nutrition by consuming inside or outside of another organism. We have detritivores and decomposers. Generally speaking, detritivores are larger than decomposers. Detritivores feed on the remains of other organisms and plants. They basically eat the leftovers from the scavengers. But even when they are finished eating, there's still some smaller pieces that did not get eaten, and that's where the decomposers come in. Decomposers are basically smaller, and they finish the breakdown of the organic matter basically and return the matter back to the soil. So you could think of the decomposers as the natural recyclers in the food chain. They will return the nutrients back to the soil for a plant to take advantage of later. Decomposers break down dead matter into important gases that are released back into the ground, the air, or water. The most popular decomposer we speak of in 8th grade is bacteria. And bacteria, when they break you down, will return the nutrients back to the soil. So other examples are fungi, worms, and again, these are natural recyclers. They return nutrients back to the ground for another organism to use later. Food web. In another lesson, we spoke of food chains. Food chains are two-dimensional, and one organism transfers its energy to another one, and then that one transfers it one. A food web is a bunch of interlocking food chains. So if a food chain is two-dimensional, you can think of a food web as three-dimensional. The food web shown how the failing of one element in the food chain can affect all the living things in another location. So in this example here, if the rabbit were to die out, the fox, who normally eats the rabbits, would have less food, so his population would go down. And if the fox's population would go down, it would affect the cougar because the cougar eats the fox, so his populations would go down. So as you can see, one organism affects the rest of them in a food web. This is a good example here. Back in the 1960s, farmers were using a pesticide called DDT. DDT was working. It was getting rid of the pests and making their crops a lot better. However, the problem is that the insects that were eating the DDT, they were dying, but ultimately it made its way to fish, and the fish were being eaten by the birds, so the DDT was being transferred through the food chain from one organism to another. And ultimately the birds had a hard time with the eggs. The eggs became brittle. They would bust open, and the bird population started to go down as a result. Here's the energy pyramid. Notice that the energy pyramid, in all pyramids, the bottom is larger than the top. So as we go up the pyramid, we have less energy. In this particular pyramid here, we have 6,000 kilocalories per square meter. As you go up to the next level, we have 600 kilocalories. The next one up from there is 60, and then the top one is 6. Another way of looking at this is only 10% of the energy goes from one trophic level to the next. Each one of those levels is called a trophic level. This is called the 10% law. In other words, only 10% of the energy moves from one level to the next. So if you start with 6,000, you don't need a calculator to calculate the next level up, the next trophic level up. You just simply move the decimal point over one spot to the left, and you go from 6,000 to 600. If I move it over one spot over again, I go from 600 to 60. If I move it over again, I go to 6. If there was a level higher than that one, it would be 0.6. So 90% of the energy is lost at each level. It's called the 10% law. The higher the pyramid you go up, the fewer organisms. And the reason is because you have less energy as you go up. If you have less energy as you go up the pyramid, you cannot have more organisms, you have to have less. You're losing energy as you go up. Every time something gets eaten, 90% of that energy is lost to the next organism. So you're only getting 10%. So you have fewer organisms. Here's another example. At the bottom are thousands of plankton, but as you move up the pyramid, you only end up with one shark. So we have 1,000 units of plankton at the bottom, 100 units in the next level up. The next trophic level above that one is 10, and followed by the top trophic level with 1. So that since the energy is 90% lost in each level, you only have 10% going up to the next level, you have fewer organisms. Here's something we call a number pyramid. This will be the number of organisms at each level. As we said earlier, the bottom of the pyramid has most of the energy, so it has most of the organisms. In this case, we have 2,500 phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are protists that act like plants. They're not actual plants, but they do go through photosynthesis. Then we have zooplankton, the next trophic level up. Zooplankton are protists that act like animals. They're not animals, but they do consume food like an animal, but since they only have one cell, they cannot be in the animal kingdom. They're unicellular. Notice that we only have 500 of those. So as you go up the level here, each trophic level goes up, the number of organisms decrease. You have fewer energy in each one of the trophic levels. Then we have the biomass pyramid. Mass and weight are not exactly the same thing. There is a slight difference between the two. But for right now, for the purpose of this presentation, you can think of mass as weight, although technically that's not 100% accurate. But the mass is greater at the bottom of the pyramid because you have more organisms, you have more energy. So as you can see, the numbers decreasing as you go up each trophic level to the very top. The mass decreases as you go up the pyramid. This is called a biomass pyramid. Bio means life, and of course mass, as we referred to earlier, is similar to weight but not quite, but for the purpose of the video we'll use them together.